Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event being run jointly between the Chartered Institute of Housing and Bristol Housing Festival. My name is Gavin Smart. I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Housing, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction before I hand over to our speakers. We've got a fantastic panel for you today. We've got Trina Chakrawarry from the National Housing Federation, Paul Smith, the really very new CEO of Elim Housing, previously Cabinet Member for Housing at Council, Una Goldsworthy, Chief Exec of Brunel Care, and Jess Sweetland, the Project Director of the Bristol Housing Festival. And the topic for our discussion today really relates, is the connection between the Bristol Housing Festival and the Homes at the Heart campaign that Chartered Institute of Housing, our colleagues at the National Housing Federation, the Association of Retained Council Housing, the NAPFED of Almos and Crisis are running together. And the purpose of Homes at the Heart campaign is to make the case for government for housing to be at the heart of our national recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The national economic recovery that's going to need to take place. And one of the things that we are saying is that housing has a role to play in terms of making sure that we drive economic activity. It has a very, very important role to play in making sure that as a nation we are decently housed as part of a recovery. We think we need 90,000 new social rented homes a year every year for the next decade. There's work to do to green our recovery, and greening our domestic housing stock is an important part of that. So there's a strong relationship between the Homes at the Heart campaign and the work of the Housing Festival in pushing forwards innovation, the use of modern methods of construction, pushing forward greener, more sustainable housing. So I'm looking forward to a really, really fruitful discussion. And without further ado from me, I'd like to ask Trina Chakrawarry to turn on our camera and our microphone and to join us as our first speaker. Trina, hi, welcome. I'm going to disappear. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm just about to share my screen so that you can all see my presentation. Good afternoon everyone, my name is Trina, and 2 years ago 4 colleagues across the sector and I set up Building Better at the end of the National Housing Federation's Greenhouse programme. We are a strategic alliance of housing associations aggregating our demand to develop using MMC. And because I've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on where I thought I might provide the most provocation, which is the enablement part of MMC, which I believe relies on working together. But first, I want to touch really briefly on the wider environment, which starts with the scale of the opportunity for housing in MMC. In 10 years, the number of homes developed using category 1 and 2 or volumetric and panelized forms of modern methods of construction is expected to double. However, there is an opportunity for a further 70,000 homes on top of that number before MMC replaces traditional construction, which is also expected to increase. And there's been a shift in the wider policy environment. There's explicit support from MMC, so strategic partnerships where 25% of the pipeline is supposed to be delivered through modern methods. A few weeks ago, Robert Jedrick was quoted, saying that that percentage might actually increase down the line. Homes England have been collecting their own metrics to prove the case on quality, but it's also important to acknowledge the risks, particularly around safety. And as a sector, we have to be prepared to take some ownership over the narrative for quality and be proactive in collecting evidence. So there's a clear opportunity and government backing of MMC, but why else should we do it? Our research with over 100 people across the sector said there's an over-reliance on the traditional construction sector. That includes all of the issues around the skills crisis and the impact on quality, which everybody in this room is extremely familiar with. But there's also the skills crisis within housing associations that can't afford to hire and retain brilliant development staff, particularly those with the skills needed to do more land-led delivery. The second is the opportunity we're missing in just designing for planning. The housing associations we spoke to said there is more we can do by thinking about how we reduce maintenance and repairs costs, and considering what our residents need over the whole duration of their tenancies. And finally, because of the nature of the current development contracts and culture around subcontracting, we don't own risk, and that impacts quality too. So MMC is not a panacea to the housing crisis by any means, which presents differently in different places, but certainly it can provide improvements to all of those things I've just talked about. colleague Jake Snell at Abri helpfully passed on these 2 articles this morning without knowing they'd make it onto the presentation. And I include them here because they represent that turning tide, both on the supply and demand sides of the equation, which leads me to my final couple of slides. How do we enable this? With respect to the principles that have driven the work that we're doing, first of all, don't start from a blank sheet of paper. You are all experts in your fields, and one of the first things we did was bringing some of that knowledge together. There are MMC collaboration groups that have come before us and failed, and it's important to understand what did and didn't work. But if I could share just one piece of insight we collected in doing that research on those groups, it's this, which is focus on the process, not the end product. Second of all, make a commitment. You could do nothing, and that's of course less risky in the short term, but you run the risk of losing out in the longer term. You could dip your toe. We are kind of more comfortable with this approach as a sector, understandably, but when you do pilots, you don't realize all of the benefits that MMC has to offer. And a third option is to work in collaboration to share in the risks and rewards, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute. But making a commitment also means being resourced properly, because that's what makes perseverance possible. And on the flip side, matching that dedicated resource with an agile way of working, because it is possible to test ideas and processes, even the riskiest one, even when it comes to development. And I'm not talking about pilot schemes, in small ways before putting kind of all your resources behind them. And then working in collaboration. And there are a number of ways to do this. For some of your organizations, a regional response will be more appropriate. For others, a national one, and there are other national groups out there. Fundamentally, I believe the more of us there are doing this, the better. But by working together, you get the benefits of the greater buying power, stronger market engagement, because you're seen as a credible partner in the marketplace. You share in the costs, and I don't want to understate the eye-watering amounts we can spend individually in paying for consultancy, legal, due diligence advice. And then there are the less realized future benefits around design and a pool of data. But how do you work in collaboration? First of all, make sure you're all agreed on the same end goal, because you may have competing organizational strategies, but finding common ground is much easier if you feel sold on a collective ambition and end goal. And then the other lesson for us has been working with the right people, and that's about finding the right organizations who are aligned in values, but more so, what's their risk appetite? Where are they on the adoption curve? Are you in a similar place? And for the people within those organizations, how much autonomy do they have? And that's particularly relevant because MMC tends to be treated as a side project within most organizations. So how much can they get on and do? And this brings me to my final slide, which is, you might say that's all fine, but what does this mean practically? So the first thing I wanted to share is the approach we've taken to design, and this is really about the process. Rather than starting with the ideal home or layout, we focused on very high-level specification, and that means we've been able to agree a solid baseline product, the ambition we want to get to on net zero carbon or future home standard, and we'll work with manufacturers to figure out the route to get there. Second of all, the procurement, which is actually also about process. Rather than open or restricted procurement process, we've opted for competitive dialogue. And that's because we know where we want to get to, but we don't know all of the options when it comes to payment schedule or accessibility criteria, for example. And we want to have honest discussions about what's possible and form a genuine partnership focused on iterative improvements with the manufacturers. Third, we're in the process of signing off use of the framework alliancing contracts, which to my knowledge isn't used much within housing associations and a little by local authorities. And we are conscious that involves some risk, but we are pushing the agenda because it puts into writing that we want to share in the risk and reward with all of our partners right in the beginning of the process. And that brings me to my final point about the partners that we work with. It's clear that we can't do everything. In fact, if we want to do a good job of what we do well, we shouldn't do everything. So we have to be clear about the scope of work, which is pushing the quality, safety, sustainability benefits of MMC and identifying partners who are experts in their own fields. And all of this comes back to one thing, whether it's why to do MMC, why innovation is important, or the opportunities that have come out of this crisis. And that is ownership of the process that we know won't consistently deliver us either the quality of build we need as long-term asset owners or the quality of life that we set out as organizations for our residents to provide. That's it from me. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed, Trina. Excellent presentation, thank you. Now I need to hand over to Paul Smith. Before I do that, though, of course, always good to be a chair and forget one of the most important things you're supposed to say at the start of a session. I should remember to thank our sponsors, Devon Britain. These kind of events can't happen without sponsorship, so we're very grateful to that, for them to that, for making sure that that happens. Paul, I'm going to hand over to you now. Disappear back into the background.
Okay, thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Bevan Britain. See, they get a double mention now. So I'm not a development expert, so it's interesting looking at the title list, doing development differently, because I think actually there's a different issue, which is doing housing differently, because one of the things I think that COVID has done is meant that our houses have changed in terms of their function. So yeah, there are places where we live, but now they also have to double up as a classroom. Our workspace, here I am working from home today, or as some people call it, living from work. There also are holiday chalets, as we have staycations and we can't go on holiday. I know with this being half term, they also turn into a multimedia centre with huge pressure on Wi-Fi and technology, as my son is running through his Xbox, as I'm trying to do a Zoom meeting at the same time that my wife is doing a Zoom meeting in another room. There also are our health centres, because we can't go to the health centres. We have to be cared for more at home. And quite scarily for some people, they're like a prison. They're locked in to places with people maybe they don't like, or even in extreme circumstances, people who are a threat to them. And so I think all of those things create a challenge in terms of not how we do it, but what we do, and how we design homes so that they can be much more flexible for people to use. And certainly we need to reflect on space standards, but also it's not just about the property itself, it's about how you can get out of it. It's about the green space that's around it, the things that actually enhance our mental health. Even though we don't have to do an hour of exercise designated by the government every day, it is still really important for people that they get out and they can get to trees and bees and green spaces. And our houses can't be built in isolation from their environment, and they can't be designed in isolation from their environment. I think the other issue is that obviously there's this huge focus on COVID, and absolutely right, especially as we've seen the figures from this week, which are pretty frightening, not just in this country, but around the world, where I think the international deaths have reached its highest level now. But because of COVID, other things haven't gone away. So we've still got the climate crisis, we've still got the skill shortage and crisis, we've still got, of course, the housing crisis, we've still got Brexit, and COVID is also delivering us an economic crisis. So one thing that we're really not short of is crises that need fixing, and those all need to be part of the context. And in a sense, that may be where MMC comes in terms of the ability to build housing carbon neutral much more easily, to skill people to build homes with a lower level of skill required than a lot of the traditional trades that you get on site in terms of the factory activity, and also to deal with the housing crisis that we have. So I agree with what Trina just said. MMC isn't the answer, and we have to be quite sanguine. There have been a number of disasters in the last year which relate back to MMC developments, and we have to learn from those. And we have to make sure that we don't replicate them, or replicate the sort of crisis that a lot of local authorities faced in the 1980s from the Housing Defects Act of the MMC housing built in the 50s. So I think there's a huge challenge for us, but what we need to do is start thinking about the whole function of the house and the function of the community and neighbourhood around the house to ensure that we get our housing right into the future. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I now I'd like to ask Una Goldsworthy to come to the stage. Una, welcome to today's session. And I think you're one of our speakers who, of course, has had experience of doing MMC development and doing it intergenerational living context as well. Really interesting to hear what you've got to say. Welcome, Una. I'll disappear again. Over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. So my name's Una Goldsworthy. I'm Chief Exec at Brunel Care. We're our housing association, but we are quite unusual in that we deliver social care for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, hundreds and thousands of people every day. So we do everything from domiciliary care, so the community pathway, right through to care homes with sheltered housing, independent living, extra care. So it's that full range of social care for older people. And I guess you probably would understand that we've had quite a busy 7 months, quite a traumatic 7 months, and we're still there. But it's forced us and made us think very carefully about what changes might be for social care housing and housing for older people. Some of the obvious things, perhaps, we just talked about with Paul around, the need for gardens and the need for home working. But what we're seeing in housing for older people is that the model of care homes is probably not the future model. There'll always be some need for that when people really are needing some intensive care and support. But for most people, don't want to go into care homes, and even less so after the last 7 months. It's quite a traumatic decision. So looking at what other models of care we can produce is uppermost in our mind at the moment. And I've got some provocations, I guess, to put to you. I've done quite a lot of work around how we can create housing for young people. And the same way as that when we looked at what we wanted to do for housing for younger people in previous roles, it was quite clear that people didn't want to be set apart from their communities. And I think the same is true for older people who want to be part of the community, want to see life, want to be part of the hustle bustle of everyday living. So how do we make sure that our housing for older people, as far as possible, people can stay in their own homes and we deliver care to people in their own homes? If that's not possible or not suitable, then actually the sort of homes that we provide need to be really integrated into that community for that level of support. Extra care is amazing for doing that, and extra care schemes are one way of providing somebody's own front door and own home, which is then helped when you need it. You can get the care coming into your home on a daily basis. But there's also something around the sheltered housing that many housing associations developed during the 60s and 70s, which are now past their useful life. And we're looking at how we can convert some of those sheltered housing schemes, of which we have many, and there are many all over the country, and certainly within Bristol, is looking at how we can create an extra care light model that perhaps is linked into a hub where you get that central support, and there might be restaurants and activities going on. But there's a satellite scheme or satellite homes that are able to link into that when they want to. So that's something we're looking at. And I think that idea of mixing up communities is really key, is really important, so that you can provide mutual support, so that we've seen it happen with all the WhatsApp groups in streets about helping elderly neighbours, and that became so important, that mutual aid, that we need to be able to make sure that the communities we build for older people are able to have that interface as well. And I think another key issue, and this relates back to the Homes at the Hearts campaign, is that our definition of what a key worker is has changed, hasn't it? So our key workers used to be teachers, nurses, what we would probably call essential frontline workers. Now our key workers are so much broader than that. Our key workers are our supermarket workers, and are our care workers too, who've been so marginalised. And so looking at how we create more social housing, and the argument about why we need more social housing can focus on the needs of our broader range of key workers. And that's about us as housing organisations changing our perspective of how we define our key workers. Gavin said at the beginning about looking at MMC. My particular experience of looking at MMC came from not the building methodology. So it wasn't that, oh, I want to do MMC. It was how can we build something as quickly as possible, because if you look at the traditional development timescale, it's what, 3 to 5 years from start to finish. Now, when you've got housing need here today, that's just too long. And one of the beauties and one of the real values of MMC was the speed that we were able to develop. And linking to that is the principle of looking at meanwhile sites. Where can we find sites that may not be permanently for housing, but could be used on a temporary basis? And some of the work we've been doing with Bristol and Paul, when he was cabinet member, and the Bristol Housing Festival, is looking for those meanwhile sites, car park sites, that you can get into use really quickly. And MMC is perfect for that, because it enables you to build so much more quickly and to go from start to finish. You really concertina it into a very short period of time. Project we did in Bristol was called Launchpad, and there's been a separate session on that on the Bristol Housing Festival as part of the festival. And that enabled us to build 33 homes for students and other young people in a mixed community in, I think the total development time was just over a year, which is unheard of. And I think that model, if you look it up, is one that we could look at using for sites that are ready for development while we take all that time to develop them, as meanwhile sites that you can bring forward for different uses. So really looking forward to what the questions might be. And please do provoke us to think differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nearly disappeared there. And finally, I'd like to ask Jez to join us on stage. As I think I had a moment or two of IT difficulties, but I understand that you're with us now. So if I can invite you up to the stage as our final presenter, you're looking very relaxed. So it's clearly all going very well. Over to you.
Thanks, Gavin, and it's a real joy to be doing this with the CAH and speaking with good friends, Paul and Una in particular, who we've been working with the last couple of years. So I'm Jez Sweetland, and I am the project director for the Bristol Housing Festival. For those of you who are probably rightly wondering, well, what is a housing festival? It is not a weekend of frivolous parties around our homes. The idea was, how can we engage the city in a narrative around the housing crisis and the complexity of that crisis that we face in the city of Bristol? We have, as was well versed across the country, we have our own affordability crisis, which is about the supply of that quality housing and the availability of land for those homes. We have a climate emergency, which adds complexity and cost to that challenge. And of course, we also have a construction skills challenge around how are we recruiting people into that marketplace to engage and build the homes that we need for our future. So the idea of the Housing Festival is, could we have a 5-year discussion with the city to showcase innovation, to socialise new ideas, and I think within that to deal with the politics of place. And so we launched in October 2018, and we popped up a number of MMC homes on our waterfront and kind of invited the public to enter into debate about homes. But the principle behind that was drawing those silos of the politics, of local government, of the industry, and of wider public all into one space where we could look at this issue and quite, I suppose, honestly, look at the complexity and the nuance of that housing challenge. And for us, there are two principal objectives with that 5-year project. I think one is, how can we enable innovation? How can we understand, Una was referring to Launchpad, how does the technology of housing, modern methods of construction, allow us to start to think differently about the way that we use space and tackle those climate crises that we face, etc. But the other element was how can we ensure that when we're looking at housing, we are focusing on people and community. It struck us that one of the real weaknesses sometimes of the built environment is we are very focused on the built environment. We focus on that. That's where we look at our placemaking. That's the story we tell. But of course, you and I, we live in homes. We are people, and we live in our communities, and our interaction is around that placemaking that makes those places thrive or not. And so what we wanted to create was a story around, let's celebrate good news. Let's look at where there are innovations and developments that should be celebrated, because they're sort of an early demonstration of how we can do things better, this sort of build back better rhetoric that we're starting to see. So that's where we are. We're a think and do tank, and our job is to be a kind of catalyst working with the local government and the industry to try and enable that to happen. And it's been great working with Paul and Una over the last few years to start to see some of these projects happen. And if I may just say, so Una referred to Launchpad. We're about to have completed our project with Z-Pods as well. And again, another city council car park, where this time we've been able to build on stilts above the car park, zero carbon homes. We don't lose any car parking space. You know, this is really good quality homes, rethinking about how we use that space within a city, building homes in existing communities around services, around bus lanes near the city centre. But for us, again, that's the technical story. What is the, as it were, the social innovation, the human story? And so for this project, we partnered with the YMCA, who had a commercial backpackers hostel in Bristol, and they had given a number of rooms over to young people in housing crisis. And so partnering again with Bristol City Council, those homes have now been in part provided to some of those young people. So they've got that move on accommodation. In addition, a number of homes are going to people on the waiting list. And in addition, we've kept 2 of the homes that are 2-bed to recruit young people who will pay a sort of almost within a civic contract, a social rent, but to take some responsibility. So these are key workers and other people that have a justification to social housing. But we wanted to create community, and so we wanted to look at how do you make that mixed community fly. And these young people that will be living there are saying, well, we will kind of provide a mentoring role supported by the YMCA to ensure that there is a thriving and healthy community in those homes. So we're about creating that think and do tank methodology and then learning. And so Launchpads, with Una and the team when she was at United Communities, we've pulled together a lessons learned report. We've just published on our website the lessons learned report from Z-Pods. And then we moved on from that to partner with Innovate UK, and the council very bravely led with an organisation called YTCO and a project called Enabling, so Inclusive Growth for Enabling Housing Innovation. And the idea there was, could we bring together a number of modular partners, MMC providers, so looking at volumetrics, so people like Booklook and LNG Modular, looking at some panelised solutions, and as well as local community and SMEs. So we've got 9 modular partners, and we're going to be building over the next 2 or 3 years about 430 homes in Bristol using 9 different methodologies of MMC. But the project is also looking at these barriers to system change innovation. So as well as those builds, it's using those builds to help the council in particular look at, well, what are those barriers to really understanding, as Paul Smith was referring to do this well and to learn lessons as we go. MMC, as has already been said, it's not a panacea. But what I particularly love about modern methods is that I do think it's an opportunity to rethink the whole system. So in that council change model, that process, what we're going to start to look at is how do we really look at the right outcomes? How can procurement, for example, become about outcomes-led procurement? So that when we're thinking about good design and good development, we're agreed at a policy level and a commissioning level what we want to procure. And therefore using things like the Social Value Act and using things like the new procurement methodologies that we're seeing developed through the Construction Innovation Hub, we have a clear understanding about what value means. And I'm afraid all too often we end up with value being around the cost of something, but not the lifetime cost, not the social value, not the impact on the NHS that we know currently spends £1.4 billion a year on poor quality housing as a result of health impacts. So for us, MMC becomes not just an innovation around delivering on that zero carbon housing or delivering on quality and the affordability of housing. It's also an opportunity to almost rewire and rethink some of the way that we've delivered homes. And if I may just say before I hand over, in terms of coming out of COVID-19, I think that one of the things that's really interesting is this whole challenge around how do we start to really up the delivery of affordable homes, which of course is where we're looking at homes at the heart. And one of the opportunities is developing a manufacturing system of homes in the UK, because there it's a different economic cycle. Those suppliers are looking for a demand-led aggregator supply chain. So we bring land and we know that whether the economy is growing or we're in recession, they will be looking to build. And if we can align around those outcome-led objectives, I think we can really diversify and increase the supply chain of quality homes into the UK. So I look forward to further conversations about the challenges and the opportunities there within MMC. Many thanks.
Thank you, Jez. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the amazing self-chairing panel who have finished to the second exactly when my schedule said they were going to finish.
Well, I'm delighted we got away with that.
If I could ask Trina and Una and Paul to also turn on their cameras and microphones as well, please. We'll go into panel discussion. We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. Now, there are two ways that Q&A works. One is that you just watch me ask our panels a series of increasingly desperate questions. The second is that you as an audience start to participate. It would be great to get some questions from the audience. You can do that either by using the Q&A and we go, typing in the questions which are appearing, or you can raise your hand and we can invite you up on stage. We can't see Paul at the moment, but ideally he'll join us in a second. I wanted to abuse my chair's privilege and just kind of kick off with the first question. I think probably picking up from the last but one point that Jez made about housing being about more than just a built environment and being about community. What we're talking about here is doing something that's quite new, that's quite different, that's innovation, that's effectively change. I think it's fair to say that all of us as members of the Great British Public are not brilliant at change, and we worry about it a bit, and we probably engage less well with change when we think it's being done to us rather than being done with us. So I'm interested in the panel's reflections on, so how do we get that stuff right? If we're going to be coming to communities and saying something new and different and a bit strange is going to be happening in your space, but good ways and bad ways of doing this sort of thing, and it would be interesting to pick some of the learning out of it. Una, can I pick on you first as the kind of person who's done some of this in the real world? Then I'll come to Trina, then I'll come to Jez, and ideally at that point Paul's camera and microphone will be working and we can speak to him as well. But Una, over to you first.
Well, I think that's the clue, isn't it, about it looking strange and different, because it doesn't have to, you know, because it. And actually, if you say to anybody in the street modern methods of construction, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it doesn't have to look different. It can be the same. I'll give you two examples of two developments in Bristol that I've worked on. And the key to that was they both used forms of MMC, not completely, but you just wouldn't know it looking at them. Both in an area of Bristol called Southmead. Those of you who are listening in from outside of Bristol, local authority estate, much investment over a long period. The two projects there. One is a scheme called Dunmail, and that has used bits of MMC, not totally, and has sort of has mixed it up a bit. And the quality of the design there is second to none. It's amazing design. It's really quality. And what it's saying to that community is, you're worth it. You're really worth it. You're worth this level of investment. And when I was at United Communities, we did a lot of work with the community in lots of different, no one thing works. You have to try everything, basically. So we did everything from working with the schools to working with youth clubs to working with the local residents group and the development trust over a period of time. And when we went through planning, we had no objections at all. 160 homes, mixed tenure, 6 tenures, quite a big scheme, and we had no objections at all. And I think it's because we'd worked so hard on the quality of the design and making people feel really proud of it. And then the next project is called Glencoyne Square, and that led on after Dunmail, which is led by a development trust in the area. That's 300 odd homes on land that would never ever have come forward for development. And again, that will use a mixture of MMC and traditional build because of the form of the development. And again, that's because it's been done bottom up with the community and with the offer that the homes will go to people who live in that community. So it's not just not all of them, but a percentage of them. And so therefore there's an ownership that actually it matters what it looks like, it matters how it's built, and it matters that it's quality. So that's just a few examples.
No, thanks, Una. Trina, do you have any reflections on this kind of debate?
I do. A slightly different tack from Una, who's got that real life kind of experience in thinking about the customer and where they are in that process. My experience is more about taking housing associations on the journey rather than customers, but I still have some reflections that I think could be interesting. First of all, Home Group released a report, I think last year, which asked customers their perception of homes that were built using MMC and those that weren't. And there's no real material difference in a lot of these situations when you're looking outside or on the inside. If it's built well, well. It feels like a good home. It feels like a warm, comfortable, well-designed home. I think also at the end of the day, people care about the quality of the place that they live in. What is the heat like? How much fuel do they have to use? And in that respect, actually, MMC has the opportunity to provide a significantly improved experience of living in their home. So there's that to contend with. And then finally, and this is maybe a bit controversial, I'm not sure as housing associations we're always confident about how to include customer voice when thinking about development. And I mean this specifically with respect to general needs. I think actually we are more comfortable thinking about it when it's different kinds of housing, but when it's general needs, we do have a tendency sometimes to say it's a box, like how much can you do with a box? And actually I think there is a role for a customer voice, and I don't think I have the answers, but I think we've probably got some work to do in figuring that out.
Thanks, Trina. Jess, I think that's probably a good place for you to come in, because actually a lot of your work is about properly trying to engage, listen, reflect, and change as a result.
Yeah, and I think this is right at the heart of the question, because whether it's innovation in terms of the way that we're building the technology, or every new housing project is in a way an innovation for that community. It's new homes in their space, in their community. So I think one of the things that we're trying to grapple with is this problem that so often when we look at the narrative in our local and national press, housing developments are pretty binary. Either you've got a terrible development because a local authority has been incompetent, or you've got a terrible development because a housing association or developer has done a bad job. And I think that we aren't good at really explaining what's going on and the complication, the nuance of housing development. So one of the things that I think we've got to focus on is how do we rebuild trust with communities? When we had that expo in 2018, to be honest, most of the people who came to see those modern methods of construction homes were said, oh, these are really nice. They look like normal homes. And so some of this is about socialization of ideas and educating people. Some of it's about honesty, about the consultation process, about really explaining to people that there is an impact on viability. If we're going to really deliver these quality homes and affordability, that how do we deal with the ecology and the sustainability of that as well? And I think that for me, a big part of this is bringing people on that journey. Our consultation process is a really good example. I think that we're not very creative in the way that we consult on developments often. And I'm not picking to people in the room, but we can be more creative. We also probably all too often allow the agency of those people who are instinctively and understandably against new development in their area to dominate a conversation. How do we advocate for the people who are desperate for homes? How do we advocate on behalf of people who may not have agency into that conversation, so at least their voices can be heard and understood? So for me, socialization, building trust, creating an honest and open narrative, and acknowledging that we can't have everything. There are whenever we build, there are some costs to that process. We have to be honest about that and explain to people why we're building wisdom into that decision making for the benefit of the broader city.
Thanks, Jess. Paul, you magically appeared just in time. Have you heard the rest of our conversation? Did you have anything to add?
No, I haven't heard anything since Jess stopped talking his original speech. So I don't know what the question is.
I kept going, Paul.
The question was really about the importance of trying to bring people. Community housing is about more than just a built environment. It's about communities and places, and how you bring communities, you work with, not do to, in order to make the best case with being kind of in his vision. We're talking about. So if you had a couple of thoughts on that, that would be great, and then we'll move on to something new.
I mean, they might have already been covered, but in Bristol, one of the things that we did massively was encourage community-led housing. So that rather than housing being done to communities, housing being done by communities. So if you look at Southmead, for example, they brought forward sites around Glencoyne Square, which the council never would have been able to bring forward. It's because the community wanted it, and there's fantastic organisations in places like Lawrence Weston and Lockleys and Knoll West that are really driving forward that agenda. And the more that we can see communities being actually in control. Now, obviously that isn't happening everywhere, and I think it's always the challenge of how do you convince communities that they will benefit from additional housing. And I know in the past the community infrastructure levy was seen as the way of doing that, is like get get this extra housing, then we'll plant a few trees or put a road crossing in. I think that we have to do much more to say to communities what the link is between them and their community and additional housing coming into their area, how they will benefit, how their families will benefit. And I think that that's an argument which can be made.
Thanks very much, Paul. Now, what's happened with the Q&A is what I hope would happen is that they've turned up like Bristol buses, so we've now got quite a lot of them. So I will try to help us get through the questions that are as succinctly as possible. I think a question probably for Paul and Jez in the first instance, but you might have a view about this as well. So Rebecca Clark is asking, so how do we create a Bristol Housing Festival in every city? And somebody else is asking, Jez, actually, have you faced any reluctance from local authorities to get involved? So question, perhaps Jez first, then, or maybe you might want to be involved in this as well. Why can't we have one of these everywhere? And do local authorities always want to do it?
So I think the first thing to say is one of the things that we're really committed to is creating like an open source evidence base, so that as we do deliver projects in Bristol, and we will never deliver them with that enabler. So a lot of them are being delivered with RPs or with the council. The ambition is that we share, and I'm not sure that I think there's something about the lessons learned approach about building that narrative in a city and in a place, the politics of place, that we could encourage other local authorities and cities to engage with. But I think also it's recognizing that hopefully a lot of the things that we can learn in Bristol, we want to then enable other cities to get there quicker. One of the things that's happening right now is we're starting to look at that regional approach as well, having the combined authority to aggregate that land and share those lessons with those wider local authority partners to bring more land to enable more innovation. So I think, we are already talking to other cities. We're already sharing lessons with other cities. We're also learning from other cities. The truth is that there's a lot of innovation and good practice happening in other parts of the UK. So one of the things we're trying to do, partly with the CIH as well now, and partly with other organisations, I think it's about bringing some of that data together to give a better picture of some of the positive stories that are happening across the country. In terms of reluctance, I think it goes back to your original question, Gavin. Some people love change, they're excited by it. Other people have got real nervousness about doing things for the first time. And I think that we've had that experience within the council here. We've had that experience working with other partners in Bristol. And that will necessarily be part of the challenge. And I think credit goes where credit is due, that what we needed was some of that leadership courage. We certainly had that with our mayor, and we've had that with Paul Smith and the cabinet, and I think we'll continue that momentum now about saying, sometimes you have to go first. And when you go first, there's an element of risk, but in going first, you also create opportunities to learn and then to share that learning. So yes, there is reluctance, but some of that reluctance is understandable and appropriate, because there are questions being posed, and Paul referred to this in his earlier speech. We don't have all the answers with MMC. We can improve it, and we need to keep going, but we also have to do it with real care and wisdom, and that means we do need those critical friends along the journey as well.
Thanks, Jez. Paul, do you have anything to add to that about why do we not have one of these everywhere?
Yeah, I think firstly it is everywhere, and that there are lessons that we can draw from other cities and cities can draw from us. So it's about that network and how we create that. And national organisations like the CIH and the NHF can be a really important part of that. There are, of course, other cities that have done things like this. Oslo had a programme called Future Build, which looked at not just in housing, but MMC and timber construction and a whole range of innovation across all types of buildings. And so I think Bristol Housing Festival is a badge. It's not just owned by Bristol, and also a lot of the examples it will draw on will not just be from Bristol. So there's no reason why any city in the country can't take some ownership in this and also contribute to it.
Thanks, Paul. Uno, I wanted to get your reflections on that question, and also then to ask you and Katrina one of the other questions, which is pointing out that in a project like Launchpad that's happening very, very fast, what quality standards are embedded there, and how can we make sure those standards are kind of checked and adhered to? So any reflections you've got on the kind of everywhere could have a Bristol Housing Festival, and then something about quality standards and checking, and then over to Trina.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please. If you could do both, and then I'll pass.
So when Jez first started to talk about the idea of the Bristol Housing Festival, I thought he was slightly off his anyway. And especially when it was supposed to be, this is so interesting because it was supposed to be like a virtual 5-year festival. I don't think we realised what virtual meant then, did we? So virtual has really meant virtual, but for this last year, and I didn't. It was one of those things that we thought, well, it might take off, it might not. You know, it might take off, it might not. I think what I hadn't realised was that the help that it would bring in able to having a wider conversation about what innovation might look like and getting that patronage and support, and that's what's been really supportive, because it's quite lonely doing things that, you know, are slightly different. Do you have a reference group? So I think that's why the Housing Festival was really helpful to me, and still is helpful to me, because there's somebody out there to go and talk to who can then introduce other people that you can talk to. So it's that sort of fostering of that creativity, which I found really helpful. And we've got, how many years we've got left, Jez? Another 3 years, is it?
Yeah, 3 more.
3 years, yay! Yeah, great. And then the other question was about the quality and standards, or something like launch.
Yeah. How do you ensure quality is embedded, and how do you check it's actually delivered?
So even if I wanted, or we had wanted to build something that wasn't completely up to all the latest building regs and fire standards and everything else, we have to, the law. So you can't get around that. You can't build substandard accommodation that doesn't meet good standard, the latest regulations in terms of building regs and fire safety. And it costs money, and it did, and we had to do it. But I'd never had any problem with any of that, because the last thing you want to do if you're a responsible landlord, is to build housing that is anyway not going to meet those safety standards. You know, I've got to sleep at night. There's no way I'd want to build anything that isn't absolutely, you know, according to all those regulations. So there's not about dodging standards. That's really important to understand. The issue about space standards, which I think has come up in one of the questions, is one really important. So Launchpad is for a particular client group, which is younger people. It's transitional, it's not forever, it's for care leavers as well. But even then, we had to meet the space standards overall. So we had to meet the space standards, planning space standards. We did that. Each studio, it's a studio, was 23 square meters, and then all the additional space had to add up to that basic planning standard of a single person's occupied space. So we weren't trying to do a race to the bottom, and it was really, really important with our conversations with the planners that we didn't want to create a precedent in the planning terms locally that meant other people could come along and say, well, they've done it, we can build smaller. So the communal space, all that additional space was key to making sure that we didn't race to the bottom. It's not what we were in.
Thanks, Lina. Trina, I'd like to bring you in on a kind of quality and assurance embedded point. And also actually the question, which I think maybe within your area of expertise, which is, and how can we bring on banks on board with financing and international stuff, because they're not always. They may be slightly conservative. So you're talking about the quality point and the financing.
So on the point about quality standards, just to answer Sam Foster's question, I'm not going to go into the detail of what quality standards we're going to, because to Una's point, I think the standards are sort of what you have to do is set. What I'd like to add, though, to Una's point is that MMC, for the members who've come on board, is a means to an end to better quality. I think at least what housing associations have been saying to us is that it's because of the nature of the traditional construction sector, it's because of the nature of how we develop and subcontract, that quality is so poor. And MMC is just a way to have more control over that process, to make sure that rather than subcontracting out, I think the average is between 9 to 14 tiers of subcontracting. So you lose all sense of what you set out to produce by the end of that delivery. But instead, MMC is about owning that quality. And then I know that there's more we could talk about, probably less interesting, but how quality assurance is part of the manufacturing process. And then on the question about Sarah Greenlay's question on bringing banks on board. It's a really good one. We spoke to banks and we said housing associations have said you don't have a strategy for MMC for lending. There's all sorts of mortgageability issues. And the main lenders said no housing associations have approached us. And I'm skeptical. I don't know if that's true, but it was in a meeting with 4 major lenders, the 2 major valuers, and some housing associations. So regardless of whether housing associations have approached them or not, I think where we're at the moment is, and this group is chaired by Mark Farmer at CAST, is that the valuers have put together a shopping list, which they've okayed with the MMC manufacturers. That list is now being circulated to some housing associations. If you're interested, please just contact me via this Gavin or Sarah afterwards, and I can give you more detail. But it's in motion, and you're right, it's absolutely one of the biggest barriers.
Una, you were looking very interested. I don't know if you had anything to say on the financing part of it. Was it an issue for you in the work that you did? And then I'd like to go to Chad.
We'll talk to you afterwards, but we approached lots of banks and lots of lenders, so they have been approached. And I think the particular issue for us was because we were looking at meanwhile sites. So I don't think it was necessarily the form of construction that was a problem. It's actually the nature of the land that we were looking at.
Okay. Thanks, Una. I know that we are slightly over time, but with your forbearance, I'm going to run on until 10:02, if that's okay, because I think this is a really interesting debate. Jez, I wondered if you could just answer very briefly there. Robbie Thornhill is asking, can you say just a little bit more about the idea of the mentoring within that? How does that work?
Yeah, very briefly. So again, we were conscious that we got 11 homes in a row above a car park, good quality homes, but we were aware of how you create what we think about mixed communities, and some of these young people living in there will be coming from fairly traumatic backgrounds, and so we wanted to give them a support process about people living on site who could maybe mentor them and encourage them if they want that. It's got to be accepted. So we have recruited, working with the council and working with the YMCA, people to go and live in those homes who have effectively taken on, as I say, a kind of civic contract, and will be trying to build and foster support and relationships so that those young people who may, as I say, be coming out of fairly traumatic backgrounds, so there is somewhere where they can go, because our homes are more than just the places that we live. It's also how we share that interdependence with other people. So that's the vision, and we will be monitoring that and seeing if with the council that is a successful way of bringing young people, particularly testing it there to help them enter into sort of jobs and successful careers.
Thanks, Jez. Now, I've got a question for all of you, and I'll come to you first, Paul. It was actually asked for you, Jez, but I think it's a good challenge for everybody. And your sort of elevator pitches on questions. So Sam Foster is saying there's a lot of talk at the moment about world-beating rhetoric for all sorts of things. I have no idea what you're referring to, Sam. But there's very little delivery of projects, e.g. that prevent climate change. So I think Sam is saying, tell me I'm wrong, that this time actually MMC, we can do something different. We can deliver against the desire to do better, to do faster, to have quite high quality, to green our built environment. Paul, give us your elevator pitch.
Firstly, I don't like the elevator pitch particularly, but firstly to say it won't all be brilliant. There'll be some of it that will be poor quality, it will be low standard, just as there's a variety, but hopefully those will be squeezed out. I mean, one of the schemes in Bristol is with Booklook. They've already built over 10,000 homes in Scandinavia. It's not new. It's just that in this country, we've been particularly reticent about moving it forward. And in some other countries, MMC is now becoming one of the major providers of homes. And the point I make again is we haven't got the skills to build in the traditional form, and we need, it's not, is it a nice option to do MMC? It's going to become an imperative if we're going to meet the demand for housing that we have in the country.
I think that's that point that you'd probably want to echo. Then I'll come to Jez then to
You're right. I absolutely echo what Paul is saying. I would add that just because it's a good idea doesn't mean it's inevitable. And so I'm all about trying to help more of us do it. And I think the way to do that is to do it together, because that's how you share in the risk and reward.
Jez.
Yeah. Look, the reality is we have the technology. One of the problems we've got, I think, within the current framework is that we are still often, particularly within our procurement, wanting to procure against price. And so one of the big innovations in this is how do we create that outcome-led procurement and commissioning policy framework so that when we're looking to unlock that technology, we have an ability to look at the longer term outcomes. And I think that's one of the key bits that MMC is going to help us do is, can we procure zero carbon quality affordable homes at pace? And that is going to mean sometimes that the price of that might be a little bit more, but we're buying those longer term benefits. And that's, for me, is the key challenge, unlocking that technology.
And Una, I wanted to come to you for the final words, because I was hoping you might also pick up on what I think is the last question we haven't answered from Lou Fletcher, which was the point about maybe as a society we place too much emphasis on younger generational issues, and how do you see that narrative changing, that we're also thinking about older generation issues. So first of all, you're kind of, can we do it? Tell us. We don't need to be cynical about MMC, and let's think about the older generation.
Very, very quickly about MMC. I went to visit ZPods last week, went on site. It was a horrible wet day. It was really nice and dry and not muddy. That'd do it for me. Any day, if I had to work in construction, it was amazing. So that's my very clear sort of MMC. It's clean. On the older generations. So older people in this country have had a really rough deal over the last 7 months, haven't they? And are going to continue having a rough deal. So the focus on how we see older people, not as just as, you know, a sort of homogenous group of people. Of course, they're not any more than young people are a homogenous group. They want different things. And I hope that some of that respect will come through about needing to look at older people not as a homogenous group that just have one needs. And I've only been working for Brunel Care for the last year, and probably I was a bit guilty of it before I started. The conversations and the joy and the love that I have seen talking to many of our older residents has made me realise that just, you know, how individual and how special people are, and how we just can't ignore them anymore.
I think that's very powerful. That applies to every person of every age and every background. It's about being treated as an individual with respect, isn't it? And being recognised as not being part of some kind of homogenous group. Now, despite the message saying this session has been extended for another 30 minutes, don't worry. That's to allow you all to network afterwards, not so that you can hear us all chunter on for another 25 minutes. We have come to the end of the Q&A. Flew by. That's an excellent panel. So first of all, thank you, Una, Trina, Jez, Paul, for a really, really entertaining and I think thought-provoking and informative discussion. Thank you to you, the audience, because without you, we wouldn't have had questions that made it so useful, so interesting. So thank you. Thank you to Bevan Britton for sponsoring, as I mentioned, not quite at the start, but nearly. And finally, just a reminder to keep an eye on the Housing Festival website, to take part in debate, sign up for other events, because, well, it is now a virtual festival, isn't it? And I think it's thriving as such, and it's thriving as such because people are taking part. So please do carry on doing that. But that brings our Q&A to a close. Thank you ever so much for being part of it. Thanks to our panel. Very, very enjoyable. Stay safe, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks.